Have you ever witnessed strange lights in the sky or experienced missing time? If so, you're not alone. These high strangeness incidents happen to people every day, all over the world, and we want to get to the bottom of them. Since 1969, MUFON has been at the forefront of UFO investigations, and we're not stopping now. Join Alex and Ruben, a team of highly skilled MUFON field investigators with years of experience, committed to getting to the truth. We'll investigate UFO events through guest interviews and witness accounts, analyzing data from various sources. Let's work together to unravel the mysteries of the unknown and get answers to the questions that have been unanswered for so long.
Hello and welcome to another episode of MUFON Up Close. I'm your host, Alex Tusia, and I'm joined with my co-host, Ruben Uriarte.
Hey, Alex. We're on again. That's great.
We just celebrated as well. I believe this episode will be our 1-year anniversary. So we started doing this last year in April. So I can't believe it's been a whole year.
Amazing. More than 20 guests now? Or
Yeah. I feel like we've talked to so many interesting people over the year. Real excited to see what the next year brings for us.
Yes. I'm assuming you've been pretty busy with all the with African cases, right?
Yeah, they just keep coming in, so it keeps my hands nice and busy. But it's been very entertaining, and a lot of good cases coming through.
I've been pretty busy with specifically, and I've been getting cases from Mexico, but from tourists that are on cruise ships. And what's interesting is that the same descriptions are being seen by the witnesses, and they're lights that are moving erratically from out of the ocean up into the sky, and totally mesmerizing the witnesses. So I've just completed 2 of them, and then what's interesting is I've been checking other websites, and there have been other people reporting their sightings. So. Oh, I think we're on to something there, Alex.
Yeah, good place if you want to see something strange. This is good. Yeah. Good season for it.
Yeah, I would like to consider maybe one of these days. Hopefully, I can go on a cruise and check it out myself, and maybe be lucky, or even along the resort there. So I'll keep you and the audience posted as things progress. But we got a great guest that we have. I've known this gentleman for a number of years, and his name is Mr. John Rhodes, and I'm really excited to have him on board.
Hey, Alex. Hi, Ruben. How are you guys doing?
Hey, John. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, you look as younger as ever.
Oh, listen to you. The years go by fast. I'll tell you, It's a time distortion as we get older. Forget all the UFOs. I want to figure out this thing about why we feel every day goes faster and faster the older we get.
Exactly. I'd like to go ahead and read your bio to our audience And Alex, do you have anything you wanted to add? Or do you want
No. I'd love to hear John's bio.
Oh, okay. He's got a very interesting background, but John Rhodes is considered one of the leading authorities as far as the reptilian humanoid or reptilian aliens. His pioneering work investigating claims of reptilian alien contact eventually resulted in the birth of an entirely new genre of study in the UFO community. In addition to researching evidence of reptilian humanoid activity, John has assisted law enforcement officials in cattle mutilation cases. John's 2006 and 2007 Montana cattle mutilations investigations led him to conclude that the mutilation surgeons were attempting to direct the public's attention to the dangers of MRSA-like pathogenic diseases spreading from a pig feeding operations. That's going to be real interesting to talk to you about that, John. Also, John's highly controversial perspective have provided audiences with entirely new view of world cryptozoology, UFOs, underground bases, extraterrestrial life, and interterrestrial civilizations. He's been on a number of shows. He's a frequent invitee. He's been invited on Coast to Coast with George Norrie. How many, John, have you done already? I think over half a dozen, right?
Well, I think it started back in 94, 1994, wow. Maybe 93, and it was with Art Bell, and it was just Premier Radio Network, I guess, with Art Bell beforehand with Dreamland.
Oh, and, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember actually Art Bell when he was doing nothing but reading newspaper headlines and before his shift into ufology and mystery, and it's been quite an evolution to see radio and its effects on society over all these generations.
Amazing. You also have been on a number of television shows on one is the History Channel UFO Hunters,
right?
Where in shows discussing the Dulce base, America's secret underground tube shuttle system, and the MIB, or I believe the Men in Black, right?
Right.
And you reside near Mariposa Mid Pines here in California, which is south of Yosemite National Park. And your website is www, and we'll announce it again, but www.reptoids.com. There it is listed.
There you go.
So John, that's amazing. I know you've done quite a lot of research. That's not even mentioned in the bio, but I'm just happy to have you here.
Thank you.
And I know Alex, you go ahead and fire the first question at John, or have him. John, just feel free to add in anything you wish to share with us.
Well, definitely,
Alex.
I'm always interested to hear more on reptilian and humanoid activity. So let's kind of start there. How did you get involved with starting the research of reptilian activity?
Many years ago, I lived in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I just happened to hear of a group of people that were getting together to talk about UFOs and things like that, odd things, and I had nothing better to do, and it was a nice social group probably to hang out with, and they may have had coffee and donuts or something like that prepared, so I went ahead and attended these meetings, and I found the people to be quite fascinating. Of course, there's always going to be the oddball that shows up in the tinfoil hat, and while we can pretty much dismiss a lot of these people, when you listen to what they have to say, there's a few of them that had something really profound to talk about. When the majority of people were discussing the little gray aliens and talking about them and their abductions or their sightings, I just happened to hear one person off to the side mention having not something with gray skin, but something like beaded skin like a reptile, and that drew my attention towards what they were talking about. And as I started looking into this, I started realizing this was something that was very unheard of. And it was at a time when the internet was so young, there were very few websites. We had chat groups. And in some of the chat groups, I started challenging them about what are these reptilian things that some of these people are talking about. I understand about the Greys and the Nordic Blondes and the people from Mars or whatever that people have been talking about through the years, but what's this new character that's showing up? And interestingly enough, I continued to ask people and finding out that there was a pattern to it, and that they shared some of these encounter patterns without knowing each other, some small innocuous kind of a comment or a detail that matched another person's case when they had no communication together and they were across quite a distance. And I realized that there were these beings that were appearing that sounded to me a lot like maybe Satan. And so I started thinking, because we're taught that's what Satan's supposed to look like, as a reptilian humanoid or in snake form talking. Mm-hmm. And that immediately conjured up all the Christian teachings that I've been through the years. And I thought there was something more to it than that, because they were talking about seeing beings in a physical form, not in a mystical, semi-transparent form. And it was then that I started looking back through the history of humankind, realizing that this image had captured us throughout history, since the dawn of man almost, and that it was highly influential in our spirituality in all cultures around the world, the image of the serpent and the anthropomorphized image of the serpent, half human and half snake. We share the same traits, so therefore we are the dragons. And the evolution of a simple snake and a bird. The two driving symbols through history have been the eagle or the bird and the snake. And you'll find these through most ancient cultures, along with the sun, of course, and tree. But the eagle and the snake were intertwined, especially as Ruben recognizes the staff flag of Mexico has a eagle with a snake in its talons. And so this image was identified with Quetzalcoatl, the entire history of ancient cultures around the world. So it had a lot of influence, but was there something more than that? And that's when I started keying in on, could they have such creatures like this if they're not coming from outer space or across dimensions, but where would they be coming from? And I kind of cracked the nut on the crypto-terrestrial point of view, where I said, well, maybe they're an extension of evolution here on Earth. And when I started looking at the science regarding the evolution of reptiles and dinosaurs on the planet, I did notice the work of Dale Russell, who is a paleontologist from Canada. And people had seen him through the 80s and 90s on television, doing television shows and everything. And he had made the statement that, according to his studies, which he did for NASA in Canada, the Museum of Natural History in Canada, they wanted to see what would the dinosaurs have looked like if they had not been devastated into oblivion, almost oblivion, 65 million years ago, 64 million years ago. And he came up with a humanoid reptilian form and said if they had been allowed to evolve on the course that they were already on, when you project forward their natural evolutionary stages of where they were headed and where they were going, he came up with this reptilian humanoid form. And I started saying, well, maybe there's a basis to this. It may be that they evolved on Earth and they left Earth a long time ago to go elsewhere, and some of them might be coming back. Some of them might still be here. But this was a very challenged perspective, because most of ufology was so focused on using the term extraterrestrial that when I came forward trying to say maybe it's a terrestrial being that has advanced parallel to mankind, but away from it and out of sight, out of mind, out of, that we only see cracks and glimpses through it, through some things that we call paranormal experiences, or we have to look back in the textbooks and see what the ancients were trying between the lines to tell us about the reality of Earth. And so that really kind of set me going. And the one thing that I'll never forget is that it was very challenging in the beginning. I was met with a lot of laughter, a lot of ridicule, but I always questioned, why did I seem like I was getting harassed by unseen forces around me when I'm talking about something it's something that people would put in the realm of fantasy, but I was actually seeing physical things happen in my life to say that some group or some, I would have to just say some group, unknown group, did not want this information out. And even to this very day, it's been a big snowball running. It would never have gotten this big if David Icke had not picked up on the subject matter from other people feeding him my research, and then sewing that into a book he had almost already completed. He called it late publishing for it, which is the biggest secret, in which he sewed this in as a separate chapter, kind of like at the last minute before it went to press. And of course, then it blew up, but it was attached to other ideas that were not of my own, that kind of pulled the whole subject matter into an area of ridicule and allowed it to get so into the realm of fantastic that it was almost starting to do the subject matter damage. And I had realized at that time it's better to sit back and let the chips fall where they may over time and see where this has gone. And I can see from the very, very early 90s through to this day, in the beginning, there was a lot of fear generated. There was a lot of anger generated with the subject matter because it's attached to our reptilian brain, and these are our reactions to it. So when that happened, it's pretty much fizzled out at this point to where people are feeling empowered by the subject matter. And there's more and more people reporting contacts and sightings that were actually beneficial to have in their life, and not something which was a negative experience that drew them back into anger and fear. Because a lot of the people who really challenged me on what I was saying were people that were violent. I mean, literally, on the internet or in spoken form, they were violent towards me. I even had to go to the FBI at one point because of death threats coming my way. But I persevered. Their attitude was, well, what do you expect the reaction to be from people? And I had to tell them it's not a reaction, that is unexpected. But at the same time, I shouldn't be having interstate death threats coming across the internet at me. Because we're in America, we're supposed to have a freedom of belief in what we believe and share that belief. And so it hasn't been without its difficulties, I'll tell you that much. And at this point, a lot of people in America and around the world are picking up on the subject matter and writing books about it, and it's kind of exploded.
Wow. John, there's several sections I would like to talk to you about in regards to the reptilian phenomena, but one is there was a TV series that came out back in the 90s, I believe, or early 2000s, called V.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was just curious where the aliens, they looked like humans, but underneath they were reptilians, and wondering did they use any of your material, or did you have any contact with that? And also your thoughts about V.
Back in the 1980s, when V was on, that a gentleman by the name of I knew by the name of Tal Levesque, who Ruben knew, he's passed away since, actually was talking to producers with the show. He presented an idea for one of the episodes and at a party to somebody, and that individual walked away with the script or the treatment that he had shown him, and it showed up on V as their sequel series that they were going to be doing. And Tal called him up and said, listen, I can prove contact and everything like this. All of this stuff that you're writing for these in this show of yours, the sequel to it, was taken right out of my treatment, and I'll have to get hold of a lawyer and proceed. And all of a sudden the sequel was killed. So that's why V was running to the ground, because producers were behaving badly. And I know this is totally unexpected, to think that producers would be unethical or, do something like that. But, you're talking about an industry which is into the hundreds and now billions of dollars. So, the ends, justifies the means, which is what I expect out of Hollywood now.
Exactly.
No, it was a great show. The original 80s one was fantastic. And they had a revival in the 2000s where they reran the show. Right. That one was pretty good too. The first season was really good. Second season kind of fell apart, but the first season was really good on that one.
Yeah, the second most recent remake of it was an interesting thing. I think it plodded along too much in the emotional part of it, and it lost touch with the science fiction part of it, because a lot of people that were going to watch that are science fiction aficionados, because we grew up in the 80s, so we have expectations to be shown a little bit more action, a little bit more CGI or whatever it might be, and it dragged the show down. It became stagnant. I was actually invited over to Hollywood to the producer's house to watch a premiere of it, and I was there with Logan Huffman, who played the young boy in it, that was the son. Yeah. And I watched the premiere and actually helped get the producer on with George Norrie on a coast-to-coast show, and they could advertise it from there. But no, a lot of production people in television, whether it's conspiracy shows, series that we've all been on, or even in the movies, they have a concept of their own that overrides any kind of research that we might bring to the table. And sadly, that's just the case. A lot of television shows we do, they have a preconceived idea in their heads as producers of what they want heard. They don't let people like Ruben bring things to the table and say, well, look at this and look at that. I've been on television shows where about Dulce, and we'll get into that a little bit, where I've gone over and done a show. I've showed them to where the location of where the actual base is. I get there with the film crew. They take me out to another area altogether saying, well, Dulce is out in here. And I just can't believe what they're doing because, John Lear kind of advertised me as saying that I was one of the world experts in the subject of Dulce. Why wouldn't they listen to where I'm telling them it is instead of taking to somewhere I don't know where they came from to think it was out in the middle of nowhere? But they did not care. Okay. And these are television producers. They did not care. They had it in their mind what was what. And no matter what you told them, they were just going to take the little sound bites that they could, even though they talked to you for an hour or two, and they're going to take those sound bites and they'll use those clips with you, or they'll provide other information you have to other of their normal hosts on the show, maybe 4 or 5 people, they're regulars. You'll hear the voice, you'll hear the things you said come out of their mouths because now they're reading teleprompters and scripts, which a lot of us, when we're doing these interviews, we don't have teleprompters and scripts.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it's that was kind of like the whole thing with Hollywood. It's a tough nut to crack. And when you're somebody that has something to bring to the table, things can happen. I remember back in 2010 sitting down at the table with the Discovery Channel, the head of the channel, okay, the person that ran it, and their talent, the president of talent or director of talent. They were going to do a TV show with me. And that was the last I ever heard of them. And within 6 months, they were both out of the network. They were gone. Their jobs were changed out. So, with no follow-up by Whitty. So, there's obviously some sort of rubber plug out there on the media. And if they can run the media as they have shown us historically now in the last 2 or 3 years, how they can run it, then it's very easy to imagine that when it comes to ufology, our government does not let anything happen it doesn't want to have happen. And that means even if what you might say on the air, it can easily be extracted out.
I remember, John, you're mentioning how culturally reptilians or dragons and those symbols have been depicted in various cultures. And I remember when I went down to Mexico, I visited the Temple of the Sun, or the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon. And there were these separate other pyramids, and one of it had the serpent head. And you may have seen it, or it's the serpent, several serpent heads that are running down the stairways of the pyramid. And I was just there staring at it, and I tell you, I felt like I was in another world just by staring at that, and it kind of was disturbing for me. I looked at it and then I thought, this is so strange.
It's very evocative. When you start focusing on the subject matter, it draws you in because there's the most ancient part of the human brain is what they call the reptilian brain. And it's on top of the neural stem. It's the first thing that grows in the womb. Okay, so all the rest of the brain grows around that. But this reptilian part of our brain, we inherited from when the time before mammals were even mammals. We all had a common an ancestor. And these ancestors were the proto-reptiles. They were neither mammals, or they were more reptilian than they were mammals. There was a split that happened in the brain case millions and millions of years ago that actually diverged what became mammals and what became true reptiles. But we all had that common ancestor. So all these really, all these kind of deeply psychological things that are triggered by the most ancient part of our brains, the flight or fight, the sex, the territoriality, all the other things that are associated with it we don't even have to think about responding. They're just like the doctor hits your knee and your knee jumps. So when people focus on the subject matter, they're starting to draw stuff out inside them. Okay, and this is why the reptilian image was demonized by the churches, and a long time ago, before the organized church religions came along, it wasn't a form that was naturally demonized. Okay, before Christianity, they really didn't even have an idea of evil. nobody did. Nobody had the concepts of really evil until Christianity came along to say, well, this is really evil and this is really good. So then they had this kind of a break in their mind to say, well, this is good and this is bad. But because it's inside our ancient brain, we react to it. You know, there's a gentleman by the name of Claude Voiture, and I'm probably brutalizing his name, but he runs a company called Archetypes Discovery, and it's basically a gentleman who looks at the ancient part of our reptilian brain, and he acts to the staff of all the Fortune 500 companies. They get their executives to come in and talk to him, and he's talking to the sales teams to think more in terms of concentrating on the reptilian part of your brain and focusing all your advertising based on the trigger mechanisms inside the reptilian part of your brain. Then you'll have what you want. And he's very successful. He did it for AT&T, all kinds of major companies all around the world. And he's very rich from doing it because he's telling them the secret of advertising is drag the snake into it. It's like have the alligator slip into the pool while it's during a skincare commercial or something like that. So they're using these images to trigger us on a subconscious level. And so when people start looking into this, they open up this part of their brain that's very ancient. And if they're doing any kind of drugs, it's even faster. It comes out faster. And things that you don't like about yourself or things that you see that you don't like or that you're afraid of will manifest in your consciousness, and you'll perceive it as an actual contact when it's actually a projection from inside your own mind of you trying to communicate with yourself. It doesn't happen to everybody, but there are those that this does happen to. So you can't say everybody that had an encounter actually had a physical encounter, because you now have to break it down into how much physicality was there behind something that could be manifested, like eidetic memory, the child that sees the diorama and you know he's looking at the diorama and the people are actually walking around in it, and he sees the cars driving around. Is it really happening? It's not. But his brain is actually laying this over his visual field and his imagination, and this is what he's experiencing at the moment. Okay, so this kind of thing happens to us even though we're adults. So you have to define that, and that's why so many people can react negatively, because it puts them into a state of fear. We don't like it. We don't like change. We don't like to face ourselves as we really are. We shy away from that. We hide from our problems. We don't want to be confronted head on with our problems, straight face to face. And that's another reason people were shutting down hearing the subject matter, because of the psychological responses.
Yeah, definitely that connection with our ancient history, and then my reaction to that. It's the surprise at why I felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
But like you mentioned there's all this connection that goes back into our history.
Well, the Mexicans are the children of the sun, and the most important of all Mexican deities is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent being who came down. He was said to have come from the east on ships of snakes, okay, and that they bore red crosses on their white tunics. This is very much like the Knights Templar, right?
Right.
And that the ships of snakes, I believe, are the Viking boats or others that had sails on them, that had dragons on them. And the chain mail on these gentlemen coming across would have looked like serpent's scales on a snake, because they hadn't seen something like this before. But when he arrived, they were all greeted wonderfully. Why? Because they had the same God, or so they thought. See, and that, of course, backfired on them, because they're not of the same God. One God preached destruction and go in and take what you want and everything from the Catholic Church. And the other one said, oh my gosh, we're expecting a savior. It's not you. But by then it was too late for the Mexican people. But this is the promised return of Quetzalcoatl to bring back the respect and the dignity of the children of the sun, is a promised thing to occur in the future. And I believe that the presence of the craft primarily down in Mexico, especially during the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
Remember how it popped? It was like the busiest place on the planet for sightings.
Yeah.
I believe that their ancient cavern systems and such underground may be harboring the descendants of some of the indigenous groups that were there during the time of Quetzalcoatl and or since, and that they may be interacting with some other kind of godly-like beings in the region, because this may be just as much their planet as it is ours. It's just that we're violent and we tend to have a far more of us than them, and that puts them in a dangerous situation.
Yes. You know, John, there's a case that I've been very interested in, and it happened in Mexico around 2000, right on Valentine's Day. There was an object that was hovering very low over a major part of Mexico City, and this object was flying right over the major boulevards, and it was spotted by a number of police jurisdictions from different districts. They would observe this craft. It just happened close to around 2 in the morning, and they were following the object, and they had a bunch of squad cars following it, and then the object landed at on a soccer field at a nearby school, and the police were not able to gain access to getting on the grounds, but they were able to get in contact with a security guard who was a woman, and she received the information from the police officers, and then she looked over and she saw all these strange lights out there in the middle of the soccer field, and so she went closer, and upon examination she saw this humanoid, or this being walking around the ship, and sort of like blind, covering its eyes because of the brightness of all the lights, from the city. And when what she did was she was able to get a better view of the being, and she said it looked like a dinosaur. She said like the skin had all these scales, and that's what reminded her. And she immediately left her job and never came back. But the story itself, being chased by the police, and their equipment didn't work, and all their watches froze, their communication systems was disrupted. It became a very well-known case in Mexico for that time, but it wasn't until later, when investigators talked with the actual witness, that she described the being a reptile. I thought, wow, that's pretty significant.
It's pretty significant if you think about it. Some of the sad things is that people that when they talk about reptilian humanoids, it's a little bit more acceptable now. When it first came out, nobody was going to say anything, especially the people that had good encounters, because they were actually attacked online by people who thought that reptilians were evil. Isn't it interesting? The humans that think the reptilians were evil were actually more violent to the opposing theorists than you can imagine. In other words, they spoke aggressively, they acted aggressively, they were more threatening. But people who were more open to the idea of reptilian humanoids, they were more compassionate, had a more compassionate point of view. So it's interesting how one attracted the more aggressive part of a reaction. Then if you allow it and were agreeable with it, you didn't have that kind of aggressive reaction towards you. As it is now, there's so many encounters taking place that it's very difficult to be able to determine what's real and what's not real anymore. When I first started doing this, there were so few people. I mean, it was just a handful of people. I would go out there. I had the first website set up to talk about this subject matter in the world. And I tried to get people to come forward and talk to me. But then after a while, when I realized that I was even being watched and being harassed, then maybe I was being used as a point of attraction for government people who wanted to know who else was having these encounters, because they would be contacting me through the website. I actually had a 50 point questionnaire that I had on the website for a long time.
Oh, wow.
And now when you get on the internet, of course, you type in reptilian or something like that, you'll get 1 million websites pop up. And it's a theory that has so much plausibility that even individuals like that are associated with Harvard or Yale recently just came out and said that, oh, it was on Fox News. Maybe the dinosaurs, maybe these aliens are actually lizard people that were, that evolved here on Earth. And these other gentlemen actually got, without mentioning my work at all like that, they got credit throughout all over the United States on Fox News and everything for coming up with that idea. Okay. And it's not that I resent that, because a lot of people are going to do that. You can't avoid things like that happening in ufology, because everybody's hungry for some way to create a niche for themselves or get somebody to pay attention to them. And but when that happens, it also spreads this word around. You know how they say you can get more accomplished if you don't care about who gets the credit. Mm-hmm. So you just allow everybody just to go off into their own tangents and everything like this. But what it does was it created a situation where now if I were to go out and do investigations like I tried to before, it would be much harder to get a realistic viewpoint on what's really happening. It would be almost impossible, because there's too many motives out there. There's millions of motives and there's stories behind it. So, and it's very difficult to weed it out. Before, when I talk to people, I could find one jewel in a box. Now it's like finding one jewel in a swimming pool. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to find the authentic cases.
That's amazing.
When you talk about the reptilians being terrestrial, does your theory tie into any bit of the Hollow Earth theory?
Yes. I remember doing TV shows, as a matter of fact, talking about that. It was tied in with not the Nazis and the Hollow Earth theory. Hollow Earth theory, as we know it, is about the possibility the Earth is more like a geode. And there's some sort of a reaction taking place in the center of the planet that's not so much heat related as is energy related of other forms, in which maybe beings could exist on the interior of the planet. We do know that only 1/2000th of Earth's surface actually has an opening, like a cave or a tunnel going into the ground. But then there's a lot of the Earth's surface we've never even walked in. And it's entirely possible that remote groups of beings who evolved and lived parallel to mankind could remain out of sight, out of mind. And we might, on an encounter, immediately jump to the idea that they're from outer space. Or with Bigfoot, we always jump to the idea that it's from Earth, without thinking it could be outer space. Why? It looks too much like something from this planet. Well, reptilian humanoid doesn't, but we've heard about it through reports. So why dismiss one and not the other? I also get people who have heard of cases, and they'll immediately come in and they'll try to say this was Bigfoot, because that's what they're into. They're known as Bigfoot hunter or whatever. Mm-hmm. So they come down to Bishopville or something and say, well, this wasn't a lizard man, this was Bigfoot. So there's a territoriality even amongst speakers. And so, that's why you always got to take a grain of salt with all these celebrities or experts. That's another experts. There's a lot of experts out there. I hope I'm not getting too off track. Am I, Ruben?
No, you're right on it.
Because it's the evolution. It's the evolution of the whole subject matter that's kind of fascinating. And especially when it's got more science behind it than anything else. We're telling Congress, give us information about extraterrestrials. Why don't we just act like a good lawyer, and instead of saying extraterrestrial, say non-human intelligence? Okay, because what if they're beings from our planet? If you keep saying extraterrestrial, their lawyers say, well, they asked about extraterrestrial, so we don't have to say anything about anything else. So you don't want to narrow your language like that. You need to broaden the language in order to capture what you're trying to do, which is the truth here. And that's where these congressional hearings and everything have really kind of missed the mark. They've never challenged the idea of where a long time ago they said, well, there is no extraterrestrial threat. Well, maybe there's another terrestrial threat where we're not aware of. The government says, well, these craft, they're not our enemies and they're not ours, and there's nobody that but we know they're not aliens. Well, if you know they're not ours and they're not our enemies, how can you tell us that they're not aliens? Okay, it doesn't fit a logic discussion. The logic doesn't fit. You can't say what they're not. You can't say what they are if you don't know. See,
John,
so but this is the government's point of view. They keep trying to trap us in with our language and our perspectives, so we don't broaden our language and start pushing for Freedom of Information Acts, listing phrases such as non-human intelligence, and drop this extraterrestrial nonsense. Do you realize that it makes more sense by now, even if something came across the solar systems to visit us or light years away, they wouldn't come on day trips. They'd leave people here or beings here. They'd set up shop. They'd be in some remote region where they can sneak in and out. And by now, how many generations of those beings have been here? Maybe they think of themselves as Earthlings too. Yeah, their ancestors came from somewhere else, but they're Earthlings, just like we think we're Americans, but our ancestors came from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. See? So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. There's more science to be pursued and to support the reptilian, humanoid, or crypto-terrestrial point of view regarding the subject matter, and we're being steered away from it.
John, what in terms of underground bases, one being Dulce, New Mexico, and probably there's other bases as well that you are aware of, but what got you connected with that whole Dulce underground base?
Many years ago, I met an individual who had presented me an idea of an underground base in Dulce, New Mexico, which is northern New Mexico along the Colorado border. And it's the Jicarilla Apache Indian tribe that have a town there. And they said that something odd was going on in the town, and this was a follow-up of the Paul Benowitz information, where he was in Alamogordo, and they were receiving information he felt over transmission lines of extraterrestrials communicating with each other or something going on. And of course, Air Force intelligence got involved, and this individual told me about Dulce, told John Lear about Dulce, and asked John Lear not to mention it to anybody, but to keep it to himself. Of course, John Lear sat on the story for as long as he could before he realized, I got to tell somebody. So he called up, I think it was Channel 8 or something in Vegas, and he did a press conference based on the information he had about an underground base in Dulce, New Mexico. And the individual that gave him the paperwork, of course, never talked to John again, because that's not what they wanted to have happen. And I got to know John Lear and this individual very well as Tal Levesque. And Tal had looked at some of the information and found corresponding information to say that something was going on there. So we did further work looking into it. And certainly there's something going on there. During the 1960s, they had a nuclear underground test not far from there. And they did it to see if a nuclear weapon could shatter shale to release gas. So in other words, like gas exploration using a nuclear weapon. And what happened is they dropped the bomb down the chute and covered it with concrete. And when they tried to blow it up, it didn't blow up. It took a week. They had a hot bomb. The water started to boil at the bottom of the shaft with the nuclear bomb in it. And nobody would go near it. It was a bad situation. But when it finally went off, it vented. So it released gas, and it released air that had, of course, nuclear radiation. And so there's reasons why the government would be wanting to look at the nearest Indian reservation to see what the effects of this kind of release of radioactive gases over the years have been. And it just turns out that that's where the cattle mutilations were happening in Dulce. And of course, the rancher Gabe Valdez got involved because of the cattle mutilations. So they were saying, well, we see weird things around here. You got to understand, when the government has something happened like that, it's an opportunity for them, even though it's not supposed to have occurred. What they now have is a testing ground to see what long-term radiation effects are over the scattered area. And so that's why their helicopters would be coming in and mutilating cows and taking animals and doing weird kind of stuff. But mix in with it the fact that even the ETs are always concerned about what we're doing with nuclear missile silos and everything. Obviously, the curiosity has been demonstrated to be there. They're around the Dulce area to see what might be going. But more than that, the Jicarilla Apaches believe that their roots come from underground, just like many other cultural Indians of North and South and Central America. And so they believe they came from an underworld. And I've been there with TV crews trying to say, you need to go over there. And they're so focused on what they're doing, their point of view. And I'll go and say, okay, you guys talk to the men. I'll go talk to the ladies in the kitchen, and I'll sit down with them and I'll hear better stories out of them where you never hear on television. For example, like in Dulce, the school there, the elementary school had a gymnasium. One day the kids were in the gymnasium with the teacher, and some little creature came in that was about 3 foot tall, looked like a fully formed human, very old with wrinkly skin and a brown skin, very brown, and had a loincloth on and was about 3 to 4 feet tall and ran into the gym. And somebody saw it and screamed, so it ran to the opposite side of the gym and it was trapped. So all the children ran out of the gym and all the teachers came from the school and everybody sat outside the gymnasium looking at the door. And after a lot of screaming and stuff that was going inside, whatever was trying to get out, it came to the door and it looked at the entire crowd and then quickly scuttled around the building and took off to where nobody could see where it went. Jicarilla Apaches they were so spooked by this. They had the gymnasium torn down.
Wow.
Right, because they thought it was some sort of a sign, an ominous sign, so they didn't want the children to ever go back in there again. Now, you don't hear about this on television, do you? Because the producers have their own ideas of what's going on and they filter all these other stories out. It's quite incredible. There's a lot of them there. Like where the real Dulce base it's not where the towers are. It's to the left of it if you were looking at it, and there's a road that goes back in there towards the Colorado border. And it's a road that on one occasion they found one of their own tribes, his head was on a spike on the road to keep people away from there, where these craft were seen coming in and out of. And another one in which they found somebody who was beaten to death as they fell through the trees or something, because it looks like they were dropped from a helicopter or some sort of craft overhead. And so they found their beaten body down, and the local sheriffs there didn't know what to say about it because it had obvious signs that had been thrown from an airplane or a craft of some sort and dropped there. These are signs of like psychological operations that are going on to keep locals or anybody else from going back into that area. They like to use fear tactics to keep them away from entrances and such. But the television shows will not listen to the experts because they know better.
Wow. Now, if I recall, John, you were working for a local television network, and you were
up in Montana.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And you came across a story about cattle mutilations. Cattle there in Montana, especially around 2006, 2007. And you were doing research, and then you discovered that that this was that there was the disease that was being spread by the pigs. There was a pig feeding operations, and the water was being contaminated, basically drinking water.
Right. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about that because the cattle mutilations research is I enjoy it a lot. It's very science-based. It's not very much speculation. It's very boots on the ground kind of investigation. I've worked with the sheriff's departments and other states as well. What happened in the case there was that the cow was left behind, not too far from a lake, and its body had been sitting there for almost 6 weeks, almost 7 weeks, and it was already getting hot in the Montana heat. And when you get there to the site, I went with Sheriff Tom Kuka. When you get there to the site, you'd see that the cow's body was perfectly preserved. There wasn't even bird droppings on it, because birds were said to land on the carcass and then get up immediately and fly off. So there was something on the carcass that was repelling predation, birds or any other stuff going on. So I looked at the cow and I took all the samples. We had gone down to look at a cow that had died 2 weeks before I got there, and that cow was stripped to the bones. So you can imagine this other one had been sitting there as a carcass, complete, intact, for 6 weeks. Not an animal would touch it. The one dies 2 weeks before, and within 24 to 48 hours, it was to the bone that the predators took it down. Nothing on that, nothing, just white bones. It was kind of amazing. But what I found out there was I was looking at the possibility of what could be causing this, and I noticed that and a lot of times the animals are found near creeks, and if they're not found near a creek, their head is posed downhill towards a creek. And so I started looking at where the lake was nearby, and then started saying, well, maybe this has to do with the contamination. Where would the contamination be from? And what I did is I got a map of Montana, and I took out all the notes I had of cattle mutilation since the 1970s and placed them as pin markers on a Google map. The Google Earth has a program where you can save all your pins and everything. And then what I noticed was, there was one or two that were way outside an area that you would consider important, but the majority of them seemed to form kind of a triangle. And I was looking at this triangle going, it was kind of weird that it's a triangular shape. And so what I did is I got on the internet and I looked at nuclear wind flows for fallout maps and stuff in the United States. And I noticed the prevalent wind directions in that area of western Montana are from the northwest down towards the southeast. And where you look in the northwest, this is where the heaviest concentration of cattle mutilations occurred. And as you go southeast with the wind, it spreads wider and wider and wider. So you're actually looking at a contamination event that's being studied, because they study it close to the location and then see where other cattle have been, how they've been affected. The further out and the wider the wind takes the contamination over a given area. The one or two areas that you see that fall outside that wind flow map are usually like control investigations, where somebody's doing it to see what's the difference between this area and something way outside it as a control evidence. And when I looked at the map, it was really interesting. I was looking at the map, and it was the cattle feeding operations in Montana. It says to update, and you hovered your mouse over this PDF map. It says, for updates on this map, call this number. So I call this number, and when I call this number, you know who answers? It was the secretary to the director of Homeland Security's office.
Oh, wow.
Right. And I went, oh, I think I must have the wrong number. Well, who's this? No, I must have the wrong number. So I hung up, and I'm going, oh no, what have I done? And why would a food, livestock map of Montana or even the United States be important? Because they all look at that now as a national security issue. And this thing with the MRSA was that I thought it was having to do with water. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is really important to people who want to research. I thought I was getting into water, and what I did is I drew a line from the opening of the lake where the nearest creek was to the cow in 2006 that was mutilated, and I extended that line out like maybe 3 miles, and I left it there as a line on the map. And then I said to the sheriff, I said, I think this is a scientific test taking place, because if it is, we'll know next year, because they'll probably take another sample on the same day next year. And Tom calls me back and he starts laughing. And I said, what are you laughing at? And he goes, well, I'm law enforcement, so I have to kind of imagine that you're part of it. You're part of the problem. And I said, what are you talking about, Tom? And he goes, well, it's a year to the day, and we just had another cow mutilation there.
Wow.
He said, how did you know? You have to understand, as law enforcement, I have to think you couldn't just know. How did you know? Okay, it's because when in 2006, I went to the Weather Underground and I looked up the weather. The wind was blowing the strongest on that day, April the 9th, 2006. That day than any other day of the year across the state of Montana. That was the strongest wind velocity day for that given area. Okay, so in other words, it was a timed test. And when I thought it had to do with the water at the lake, and the next year when he called me up and said there was 2 calves that have been mutilations. You want to come have a look at them? And I did. And when you looked at them on the map, one of the calves that was mutilated was dropped on the same line that I had extended from the original cow in line with the lake. And when I was standing there on that spot, I said, "Oh, look, there's a nuclear missile silo," because they have a lot of them around there. And so what I did is I looked at where the nuclear missile silo was, and then beyond that, I could see a tower, and I was like, "Well, what's that tower?" So when I figured out what the tower was, it was the water tower on a Hutterite pig and chicken farm. And what had occurred back there before 2006 was there was pig manure, up to 3,000 gallons of it accidentally dropped from a disposal creek into the lake of drinking water that fed all these communities. Wow. Okay, so it was tied to an event actually occurred, and suddenly there's the mutilation that takes place, and then they watch over time how it occurs. And what I discovered was, number one, for them to have dropped that cow directly on that line, somebody had to have known it was in alignment with the other cow in the opening of the creek, and to triangulate it. So when you look from that point on to the nuclear missile silo, directly behind it at like a mile away was the Hutterite tower where the contamination came from. Okay, wow. See, it was an environmental issue, and I never really thought that I'd be doing environmental research. I thought I was looking into UFOs or some sort of mysteries like that. And then I realized, talking to people and investigating it, a lot of the people up there were ill, met a lot, and then their MRSA, which is stuff you can get that the antibiotics don't work on, that colonizes in the nose of pig farmers. It gets into their nasal canal. And even though they're not showing signs of infection, they've got it in their nasal canal, and they found this out in Canada. So what happened is we're finding out that these farmers and the livestock groups were taking the pig feces and the pig urine and the chicken feces and mixing it up in water and putting big fire hoses and spraying it into the air, and it was being spread all over their fields as a fertilizer, not thinking about what happens when all this gets into the water table that everybody's drinking from. Okay, so it's an environmental issue that's just sitting there. Oh my God, it's a disaster that's going to take place if it doesn't get stopped. So the advice from us was, to tell the guys in the region who's in charge of commerce and this, that, and the other, that they've got to get better control over the water quality and what's going on in here with pig and chicken feces being spread over their fields and into the streams. Because you can't take chicken feces and pig feces and urine stuff and have it put into our food chain. And that's what they're doing, is they're testing all the mucus related things up front in the animal, like its ears, its cheek. They're taking all those tissue samples. They take the tissue samples out the anus from a coring. They compare the two, see what goes in, compares what comes out, and then they check the udder, and they're finding out how these parasitic organisms are getting into the cows and what effects they're having on the cows, because a lot of those cows are very expensive. Their semen sold around the world for bull stock. So if this genetics change starts coming over these animals in some way, it's going to start happening where all these big, expensive $10 million bulls are.
John, so I got a question for you, but first we got to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk more about these cows.
Great.
from Iraq and Afghanistan. Our brave warriors are coming home, wounded. Some with wounds you can see, some with wounds you can't see. Wounded Warrior Project was created to support our men and women coming off the battlefield. Please help carry these warriors the rest of the way home. Get involved at woundedwarriorproject.org.
MUFON is the voice of thousands of like-minded people who want to see change. We speak up against UFO secrecy. We engage governments and agencies around the world on the topic. We share information with the public through our journal, website, newsletter, social media, and even our own TV channel. When you join MUFON, you add your voice to the cause. Few things are more important in our time than understanding the UFO question. Join MUFON. Find your friends.
And we're back. John, so my question as you're talking about this, why cattle? Why is cattle the kind of the baseline that they're looking to examine of all the animals that they could have chosen?
Well, I think it's because the prevalence of eating beef in the United States. It also corresponds to the time in the 1970s when major corporations started getting into beef production. They started taking these small cattle farms that allowed cows to roam freely across the fields and everything, and shoving them into big houses with not 100 or 200 head of cattle, but maybe 5,000 or 10,000 other head of cattle. And when that happens, it's very easy for diseases to be passed around between the cows. That makes the big bad guy in this, the big corporations, and their ways that they're actually, processing and growing the meat and then processing it. Because there's certain things about it that, are tricky when it comes to that. And I think that since beef is a major product in the United States, it had the greatest reach into our market. So they were looking into that specifically. Keep in mind that, ever since I remember doing the Coast to Coast show and we were talking about it, Sheriff Tukuku and I were on the show together and we were talking about it. And afterwards, I spoke to the gentleman who was on the television show with Oprah Winfrey when he said that, hey, there were some bad things with beef. And Oprah said, I'm not going to eat beef ever again. And there was the big lawsuits. Remember this? It was in all the news. Okay. Now, it went on for a decade or two, and they were both taken to court because it had such damaging effects on the meat industry. And then he told me once after hearing the interview, he said, John, he says, I want you to be aware of something. He says, after we won the lawsuit, and Oprah paid for my legal fees. But Bush Jr. was in office, and he said or Bush Sr., I can't remember which one, he says, after the lawsuit ended, the president had pushed through legislation to say that if you say to the public anything to make the food industry look bad or to cause a public panic over any kind of food item like that it was an act of terrorism. So he said, so just be careful when you're on radio or television talking about this subject matter, because they can hold you accountable because they have all these sensitivities to things. So, just beware. And I am now, and most of the time when I'm dealing with different sheriff's departments, I talk to them about certain things they can look for and everything, and then how to locate any kind of problem areas environmentally. And then the third thing is advise them all. I don't want to have my name in a newspaper. You shouldn't bring my name up or anything like that, because this is an environmental issue. It might end up costing a lot of money for your area and stuff. And it can be very volatile. So just to take this to whoever's in the authority and see if there's something that you can look from on that point of view. But I wouldn't start telling anybody that this is an environmental issue, and none of them do. They always like saying, oh, they're UFOs, because that's so innocuous. It doesn't point out that there's a real issue to be looked at. As a matter of fact, it does a disservice. It makes people think, no, oh, you're crazy, and there's nothing to look at here. In the mainstream, if you tell them this is an environmental issue that's being studied, and obviously by some group, it has to be like the rogue millionaire in the movie Contact or something, where the rogue millionaire has a group that's working with him alone, and they don't care about, they're leaving clues around to try and get us interested and looking to what we have to find. They won't come spell it out for us. Sure, they could leave a note in a bottle, right? They could do something remarkable like that. They could write it out on a field in English if they really wanted to, but that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to draw our attention to it and have us socially push forth for more environmental research into the area. And it's really fascinating. The thing with lions has just got me. I'm looking all the time now. When I think of craft, you should get out Google Maps and look at your area and draw flight lines and flight paths and areas of travel. A long time ago in the 80s and 90s, this is what we were doing. We were taking maps on the walls. For God's sakes, we were sticking red pins and putting strings around from one spot to another, trying to figure all this out. And it was a hard road. Nowadays, you have all these tools for research you can use. Google Earth being the best, I think, in my opinion, because you can get eyes on the ground. You can't go there, but you can see a lot that's happening. You can determine patterns, and it's all about patterns, and mathematical patterns and things like that. Whoever's flying these crafts up there, they think geometrically, they think mathematically. This is the way their brains are working. They're not thinking in like we do, with a kind of a blurry murkiness of trying to control our emotions, that control our thoughts and all that kind of indecisiveness and emotional content into it. They don't have that possibly to deal with. Their minds are a lot more clear. So you have to look in terms of math and geometry as well at the activity. And sadly, a lot of people don't do that. There's a lot of armchair researchers are saying, well, it's the Anunnaki and they're from Draco and they're from this. And you know what? For entertainment's sake, a lot of people get into ufology just like they get into science fiction. It's a branch of science fiction after all, isn't it? But then there's the individuals who are true seekers, who are not in it for the entertainment. We attend conferences and everything because it's nice to see people we used to know or still know. It's nice to see there's some old guys like them, like myself, that are still alive, or Ruben Alabaju, you're older than I. Or was I not supposed to say that? Anyway. Yeah, we're disappearing.
We just don't look it.
You just don't look it. Well, you have to keep your sense of humor when you're into this field of study, because it can be very dark, and you have to be able to laugh at it, and you have to be able to grow with it. Because what I thought I knew 10 years ago, I'm going, I know nothing about it. The older you are, the more you don't know, because there's so much out there you haven't been exposed to. But the greatest thing was the mapping and the think in terms of geometry and math. And also, why go looking for UFOs? Don't go looking for, what I do as a crop circle researcher, if I was a crop circle researcher, and this hasn't been done, because you have to have novel thinking. Okay, crop circle research, they're obviously watching what's going on in the ground, trying to communicate. Okay, why doesn't somebody just start a hopscotch board? Okay, why doesn't a crosswords where it's like, 2 lines, I'll put an X, and I'm going to wait for the 0 to drop in. What you're doing is you're challenging them, inviting their playful side to be able to come down and do something where you might be able to see them actually come down. It's like putting bait out for a bear. We need to do things like that in order to capture their curiosity. Because if we're doing everything, if we're researching like everybody else is, they're not interested, because they've seen so many billions of us. The billions don't stand out. It's the one in the crowd that stands out, facing the wrong direction. Them. That's what grabs their attention. Okay, so when you strike out to do some research, do it in a way that's going to capture their attention. You have a heightened increase if something happens. It's kind of like the play on doing the light thing. You go out for a UFO watch. I'm going to flash my headlights or something like that. Well, it's a little different if you go out and you take, for example, a strobe light with a variable gas strobe light. So you can use different gases and use like a xenon or something like that, and then pulse that light in infrared because it can't be seen to the visual range. But if you're out there in a flying craft and you're pulsing, you see a pulsing infrared light or a pulsing ultraviolet light. If you're into science fiction or flying a craft like that, you're going to say that's unusual. It's a pulsing ultraviolet light. We don't see that very often. What is that? And they'll come down and they'll have a look just out of curiosity to see what it is. See, so it's about figuring out what can draw them out, and you have to do something completely unusual. And if you're repeating what other people have done, you've lost it already. Some people have been known to go out into the desert and do magical rituals, and they've seen craft come down because it's an anomalous thing for humans to do, for a group to get out and form a circle in the desert and do all kinds of strange things like that. And they're wondering from their own point of view, what is going on? That's what captures their attention. If normal activity doesn't.
John, I wanted to ask you on the cattle mutilation discoveries that you made. I think I recall that you mentioned to me that it looked like two of the cattle looked like they were picked up and then dropped. The body fell, and there was the imprint. I believe you mentioned that, and that always fascinated me. That the fact that this animal, as big as it was actually lifted and then dropped, and no,
right,
none of the predators.
And some of them are dropped very violently. You know, they'll find their leg bones shoved up into their cavities and stuff from impact. And some of them have been found, you know, making snow angels like in the ground because they've withered. You know, they've struggled while they were dying. So you see they see the marks where they've kicked their legs up and down on the ground. But then when you're looking around there, you don't see anything. You don't even see bent stalks. You might, in 2006, that cow there was something that looked like a ridge line, like about 4 feet long. And it looked like somebody had laid a piece of metal down. And I think what somebody did is they lowered a hatch, and the hatch rested on the ground while they disembarked the animal off. And they must have some sort of levitation technologies, because we've heard people before being levitated right through a wall of their house, for example. You know, it's like they're taken out, and so they must have some sort of levitation capabilities. Also, the thing about no predation, there's no insects or anything like that can be found. I ended up cutting the head off the cow that was out there for 6 weeks, the most disgusting thing I've ever done. So I can take it in and get a necropsy done on it, which is like an autopsy for animals. And I had a vet do a necropsy on it. Now the brain had already autolyzed, which is it's in the heat. The brain in normal temperatures, a little warmer than normal temperatures, within 3 days liquefies, because most of it's fat and sugar. So, you know, in 3 days, you don't even have something solid to look on to see if there's been any damage that you can find. The cattle mutilations, I think, are probably the one thing that I really enjoyed doing. There was also a time in which I had a feeling that somebody was watching me late at night while I was doing my work. Now I'm up there, it's in Montana, and I'm thinking to myself, it's 2:00 in the morning. You know, of course, my mind's going, are the aliens watching me? You know, how do they know that I'm drawing these lines out on these maps? And they drop the animal right on the line that I have. But one time it was really interesting. I've heard it before with other people when they've had an encounter, their psychic capabilities ramp up. I didn't feel anything near me. I thought maybe there was, but that's just my own paranoid self at work. And one night I heard this terrible crash, and I look out the window, and there's no reason to account for this terrible crash. I mean, it sounded like an airplane crashed, or a car crashed into a house or something. And I expected to see all the lights on the neighborhood light up, and there was nothing there. And it was the next day I found out in the news that in another city in Montana, exactly at that time, an airplane had crashed and killed 4 people on board off the end of a runway. And I'm a pilot as well. I'm very interested in aviation. So that, kind of grabbed my attention. But it was interesting to think that I hear this thing that sounds like a plane crash, but I can't see it, to find out that that's exactly what the time one occurred in another city. And so I think that kind of thing I was attributing to maybe being some residual resonance from being around a higher energy system or something like that. The aliens that come in, they're vibrating at a different rate, maybe because they're using a cloaking device or something like that. So it leaves us like a tuned up tuning fork until we dull down a bit, after the event. And I think that's why the heightened science or the heightened psychic aspects of your experience kind of, diminish over time. But cattle mutilations. It's not what you think. It's actually much more interesting.
And it's still occurring, the phenomenon.
Still occurs.
And they never found, they always thought that it was being done by somebody, but they never caught anybody.
Oh, they never catch anybody. And if they do, it's kind of obvious what's going on. Even the FBI said this is not satanic cult activity, but the newspapers and the press all like to write that off to it. For God's sakes, if we start saying the word, it's an environmental, it's presenting the possibility of an environmental problem. That's a major news story, and they're not, news networks in your local towns are not going to want to carry that. They won't show that news. They will bury that faster than a UFO story. If it has to do with pumping out millions of dollars or having a Superfund site set up because of some idiotic activity that the government's done over time.
I remember. I'm sorry, John.
Go ahead.
I remember you had mentioned, going back to the pig issue, the water being contaminated, that the ranchers weren't happy with you, or they didn't want this information to get out.
Well, they didn't mind. They didn't mind that people were interested in it. They don't. They're just farmers. And ranchers. That their hands are on the and boots are on the ground. That's where they live. They're down to earth people. They don't really care. The authorities care. Even law enforcement. Tom Kuki. I asked him, look, there's a nuclear missile silo like half a mile from where this thing was, less than half a mile, quarter of a mile maybe, from where this cow's carcass was found. Now, can you get on the phone and call Malmstrom Air Force Base and ask them if we can get a copy of their surveillance video footage from their fence line in the direction of the cow? But even he hesitated. And we never got anything because even a sheriff on that level, when they realize the state is closing them off, they're all intelligent people, the deputies and everything, they're going, this ain't no predation. What are people saying on TV? They think it's totally misrepresented, but then at the same time, they recognize if the state doesn't want to address it and get involved, it leaves the county sheriffs and their deputies all holding the ball with no one to appeal to. So then they go, well, we're up against a glass ceiling and we're not getting any answers on the state level. And they just keep, throwing us a ball saying it's just, lightning strike. It's like the governor of Montana had his own cattle mutilation at one time. And he says, well, I can't imagine this thing was hit by lightning like the farm guy was trying to tell me. The farm experts were trying to tell him it was a lightning strike. And he goes, this thing was surgically operated on, and it is surgical operations. I've taken the skin tissues around the incision lines, and if you look at them carefully, you'll notice that the hairs on the outside of the carcass were actually curled around like a curling iron hit it, and the tips of them were buried into the underside of the fat. So when it hardened up, you're looking at. And I was like, well, that wouldn't happen unless it's subjected to heat. But then when you look at the cut lines, you recognize that there's little pulse nodules along the lines of the incision. So somebody's using a pulsed laser incision or a scalpel, pulsed laser scalpel in the field or wherever they're doing this. And who has pulsed laser scalpels? These are things that hardly anybody has, even in regular hospitals, let alone in a mobile unit. Mm-hmm. See, but you try and get that stuff on television. Oh, they don't want to hear about it. I've been to producers and shown them evidence to where even Hollywood was involved in covering stuff up And I've never heard from that person again, because they get scared. Even the producers get scared that they're not going to get a job in Hollywood because obviously somebody's putting a kibosh on certain things.
John, it kind of reminds me of the situation with UFO hunters. Bill Burns went to Dulce and
Right.
took some pictures of some really unusual mutations of animals that looked like one had like almost a human face to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing about this on which George Knapp, he interviewed him, and apparently that was what ended the UFO hunters, was the fact that these pictures were so controversial that the History Channel got a lot of flack, and then they put a plug on it.
John Greenwald was the segment producer on that. He's the one that pulled it together for the show. And John called me and said, John, what do we need to show them? With having to do with Dulce. And so I thought, well, I know that Bill said that he's working on a thing because he was going to be interviewed, and I knew that. John Lear had told me. He says, Bill's going to be working on something to do with a cow carcass, or a mutilated cow of some sort, or that the vet had a photograph of a newborn calf and it was deformed in some way. So what can you bring to the show? And I thought, well, I haven't done this. I've talked about the nuclear boring machines that the government had designed back in the 1970s. They used nuclear power to melt granite. Granite can melt into a liquid at 2100 degrees.
Isn't there? There's a patent for that machine, isn't there?
Huh?
There's a patent for that machine, isn't there?
Oh, there are patents. Yes, developed back in 1972. The lead scientist for the Rand Corporation did an interview for the LA Times, and he said that back then they had the technologies to actually create trains that would go in a maglev system in a vacuum tube from New York to Los Angeles in less than 15 minutes. No, 20 minutes. He said because they can reach 15,000 miles an hour without any discomfort, no big G pull or anything, just constant 1G for half the distance, another 1G in the opposite direction for the other half the distance, which is about 1G is what you feel when you're taking off.
Sure.
And he said that and other than that, there's no sense of speed or movement, and they could move people across the United States in 15 to 20 minutes. And so where is all this technology gone? See, the government has employed technology like this, but not us. So what I did is when I was living down in Vegas, Bechtel was in charge of the test site at the time, and they had a public library down in Vegas. And I went to the public library section of Bechtel, and they had declassified photos and documents on computers. So I put in thermal boring machine. And sure enough, the photographs of one being tested at Los Alamos Laboratories showed up, and there was 4 images. They told me I can get the images the next day. They just needed to burn it to the disk. And the next day they called me, said that the machines that they were used to transfer this thing onto photographic paper weren't working. And so they might not be able to do it, and they'll call me back. And then they called me back that day and said, well, we can get it done, but it's $600 a photograph. And I'm sitting there, $600 a photograph. What the world, And I said, I'll tell you what. Okay, I'll be down there tomorrow. So I went down. I took all the money I had. I gave them all this cash. I didn't think they thought that I'd bring down that much money just to get some photographs. I got the photographs. The next day, I get another call because I took those back and I photocopied them and sent them off to all kinds of people that I knew. I get another phone call from Bechtel in the library, and they said, you have to bring that back. And I said, why? And they said, it wasn't supposed to be on the declassified part of our system.
Oh.
And I said, don't tell me that now, because I've already distributed that. Okay. So what I did was that, of course, over a decade, you can see where that went, finding those patents and putting those out. It just took off. I've done a lot of things like that, that just seem to take off. But the interesting thing about that is that I said to John Greenwald, we should show the patents of this technology and talk to people how easy it is to build these tunnels that are going underground from facility to facility. So that's the other part of what we had on that particular show about Dulce. Now, how do I know that that created a reaction? Because a counterintelligence operation took place in which a woman was chosen who was previously very outspoken about the negative activities of Homeland Security and their Department of Operations and such. She was writing articles about them. All of a sudden, now she's allowed to be the first author that's allowed to talk to workers at Area 51. And she writes a book. And she goes out there and she gets on the air and she's talking to the news stations about her book. And she, every time on the two, and I recorded these interviews, every time they talked to her on the two major news networks, every time that they were trying to get her to round up her talk at the end of the interviews about the book, she'd go, oh, one more thing I'd like to say. You know, there's these rumors out there about underground tunnels and being connected to all these bases. That's just a bunch of that's just a bunch of baloney built up by a couple of drunk guys at a bar in Vegas. Okay. She made sure she said that, even though she wasn't asked about tunnels or anything, on both interviews from two different network stations, and there was nothing in her book about tunnels or anything like that. So somebody gave her access to all these scientists to be the first person to talk about Area 51, but the vehicle of her appearances on television was also to tell people there are no such things as underground tunnels linking underground bases.
Tell us more about these tunnels. You know, what kind of technology is it? Trains? Is it maglevs? What's going through these tunnels?
Maglev trains that are underground in a vacuum system, and because of that, there's no friction on the rails. Because of a vacuum, there's no air resistance or anything like that. The trains were said to be propelled forward, and the energy that they had by using their brakes on the braking part of their trip would be put back into the line, so it would help feed energy to the train traveling in the opposite direction. So they had these very, very well thought out. They also said they could send pallet cars with only split seconds between each pallet car across the United States in less than half an hour, so they can deliver goods and such. And I think that the government has had these in place. And I think prior civilizations or even aliens may have built something similar on our planet in different areas, but definitely the government has them, and they use these for transportation of goods and nuclear and war materials during times of combat. And the underground inside the United States, we already have steel factories. We have factories that build just about everything you can need. Duplicate factories actually underground in operation. And some of these underground facilities use the products that those facilities make, as well as using them by products brought to airports and into hangars that suddenly disappear. They don't come out of the hangars. They just go into the hangars, and then the loads are empty when they come out, but they're not coming out of the hangars. So there's suspected that there's elevators inside certain hangars at airports and government, especially just general aviation airports, that are actually linked into this tunnel network that feeds supplies into them. They don't really want to use their own stuff as much as possible unless it's a long-term base. There are individuals that have Q clearances and top secret clearances that are encouraged to go on 10-year, 20-year contracts with the government. They disappear from the surface. They actually recruit these guys based on their military questionnaires when they go into the military, any living relatives. They like people who have no living relatives or nothing answerable or nothing to live for on the surface. They get them big jobs. At the end of their 20 years, they encourage you with more, better facilities, underground living conditions. And it's all basically like imagine Caesar's Palace Mall, where they have it to make it look like the avenues you're walking down the street. They've got the pillowy, clouds on the ceiling and the nights at light to make it look like stars. This is the kind of place they're actually having underground. They give us the idea that they're just solid steel and pipes running overhead and concrete bunkers that are gray concrete. They give us that impression so it doesn't look so inviting. So most people would think, well, why would I go live in there? Okay, but there's already thousands of people who live there, and it's suspected there are thousands of people who may live there who have never even been to the surface of the earth. In other words, they've created subsurface civilizations. So if something happens, our hierarchy can filter down through the top down into a society that already pre-exists underground. So that's
one of our friends, Earl Grey, he talked about, his mom, worked in one of these facilities, and she told him about these as well, where there was a hair barber down there, like a hairstylist.
Right.
And that was something that, caught Earl off guard, because he thought, how long are people down there for if they need to have a barber down there and they need to have all these conveniences? And that really struck out to him that, people are down there for, long periods of time. Like you're saying that, these 10, 20-year contracts make sense because, they wouldn't want anyone to be going back and forth or see, mass people going in and out of these facilities.
Right.
They're down there for good. They're down there for, essentially their careers, living
it's
down.
It's very expensive, and it takes a lot of manpower to make sure that nobody's talking when they come to the surface, unless you've altered their memory. And now we know that they can alter memories. So, I mean, that's been in the news that they can do that. You can target your own specific memories and wipe them out. They are so advanced in the memory field. It's unbelievable. They can alter short-term memory. So you can have an encounter with the Men in Black and you come out of it and you don't even know what's happened. It's gone because your short-term memory that made you remember just, hey, like what just occurred, it doesn't even have any function anymore. And they do that by taking like a botulitis type of injection that they use for nerve to kill the nerves and stuff. They have things like that they can put in the back of your head and put it into your brain. And basically it deadens all the nerve cell activity that sends things to long-term memory storage. And that lasts a certain period of time. And some of these experiences you can come out of and seem seamless. You could be walking along and then find yourself still 4 hours later walking along. From your perspective, nothing's happened. But the weather may have changed, or all of a sudden it's nighttime, you're going, whoa, something's weird. It's kind of like when I talked to Glenn Dennis before he died. And I said, Glenn, what's the strangest thing that's ever happened to you? I mean, I know you had this experience. He says, well, coming home from East Helena to driving into Helena, it's only like a 15-minute trip. He says, I was wondering why it took me almost 50 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes to make a 15-minute trip. He says, and he could never wrap his head around that.
That's Glenn Dennis from Roswell?
Yes, he was the son that held the objects that his dad brought home. So, and he's now passed on. But he had his own missing time experience up there in Montana. And not far from where I actually one night had, late at night, doing some research. I'd taken the dog out to do his little business before I went to bed. And I always had a feeling I'd see something over a mountain ridge one day. And sure enough, I came outside and I was looking and I saw a light appear over some mountains close by. And the light rose up into the air and it started traveling down along the contour of the mountain about maybe 5 or 6 feet over this mountain. And as it traveled, it left a long tail of light that looked like liquid mercury, because it was maybe 60, 70 feet long, but it was wavering, like it was trying to catch up with the tail end of this thing. And when I saw it, I went, oh my God. And I looked up at it. And just as I saw that, the object lifted up and suddenly came to a stop. Just as soon as I made the eureka in my mind. Oh my God.
Wow.
And it sat there. And then I turned around to get my binoculars and I came back and I saw a flash and I couldn't see it anymore. And I was looking at the only nearest cloud nearby and I'm going, I bet you're in there. And I want you to know that I caught you. So, I could never explain that, but it wasn't something carrying a human. It was smaller. It was maybe the size of a basketball or something. It was like bright white light, and that mercury tail behind it was just so beautiful. It was captivating. So Montana seemed to have a lot of this activity taking place, as do a lot of areas.
That's amazing, all the experiences that you've gone through. John.
If you put yourself out there, you'll have experiences too. A lot of people don't get in the car and go driving across Arizona at night or something alone on a road or with a friend of theirs, because that's how you have to put yourself out. That's when you're going to have your experiences, because there's nobody else on the road to act as eyewitnesses. And if you're a person that's interested in that subject matter, it's real easy for events like that to somehow find you, because they're kind of, whoever's up there is not just playing with the Navy, they play with us like children.
Exactly.
They'll come down and wink and nod at you, and they'll act like they're going this way. And when you think, oh, they're going that way, you'll look, and then no, they went the other way. So they're acting very playful.
You mentioned it sounds as you evolve. I mean, in your research, and it connects you from, the reptilian research to cattle mutilations and to this other. Where do you think you're going with your research, John? How do you see it evolving into other areas?
The cattle mutilation research did kind of turn me on to looking at maps more with Google Earth, and it started my mind wondering. And I've made a discovery that's bigger than the reptilian thing, and it's bigger than cattle mutilations, because everything can be verified. But I'm just not ready to talk about that yet. It's something. It's something that's so easily verifiable and shocking. But I'm not sure that that's my position. I don't want to say anything that's not in my lane. How do you, if you knew a secret, but then you know that there's a lot of people keeping a secret, can you talk about the secret even though you've taken no oaths of secrecy or something like that? And what are the ramifications about revealing certain secrets? Look at even just revealing the reptilian humanoids. There's a woman sitting in jail now for the rest of her life because she killed somebody after coming out of a David Icke conference. Afterwards, went and killed this woman that she was convinced was a lizard queen. And when investigators were trying to find out what she did with the body, they know that she killed her with a sword, so they're thinking that she ate the body. And this woman is still in prison. And I communicated with her at one time, just asking her about, what she went through and, what caused her to start thinking this way. And of course, her responses weren't exactly pleasant, but she just went on and on about the reptilian queen and this, that, and the other. So you couldn't make really too much sense of it. So the person was obviously mentally challenged in some way that put them over the edge. But see, this subject matter can put people over the edge. So, do you tell them everything, or do you hold back on some things? And that's part of a researcher's quandary, is to know what to hold on to and what to share. From a researcher, because we need to hold on to control information. For example, okay, that there were red shoes in this case over here, or they saw a craft that had purple blinking lights, and you hadn't heard that too often. If you don't talk about that and you hear somebody else talk about purple blinking lights, now that starts to make more sense to you, because you haven't talked about that control information, yet it's present in another case. So you use that as a factor to help you determine authenticity of what's being reported, instead of somebody just making up stories, because the chance of them making up stories the same color or something like that are too impossible. Same thing with, finding out who you can trust as UFO researcher. You just get a list of paper down, and you write down the people that you want to question their trustworthiness. You have a story, and on the story, it's got to be interesting enough. And then you tell the story to each researcher, saying, please don't tell anybody this, keep it between us. Yet each research you gave on the piece of paper had a color identifier that was different. So if you hear that story out there and they talk about a red pair of shoes, then you know which researcher was talking and which researcher you cannot trust anymore, because a red pair of shoes, that detail that you held out as a control information, now is being spread out there, and you had that attached to that person's name in the little piece of information you dropped them. Now that's not telling them a lie. All you're doing is changing one detail. But because you got to think about who you're talking to. there's a lot of individuals out there who want to be speakers. They want to get on a UFO circuit. They want to take the cruises and have everybody listen to them and buy them dinner. They like that. They like being on TV. They're very hungry for information. And that's why a lot of researchers do not connect together. They don't share information because the activity within ufology has demonstrated that once you say one thing to somebody, it can just be minutes before they cut you out from under your feet and do something that they've said that they're not going to do, simply because they need the notoriety for it. Yeah. So it's for a lot of people, I can understand where they think this isn't it's just not worth it, because what do you have to put up with? There's not really money to be made in it unless you're pumping out books, but then everybody's got books now, so what can you do? It has to be a life passion. And if it's not a life passion and you're looking at it to make money, yeah, you're going to put out a whole bunch of stuff that's not going to be true, but what do you care? You're making the money. But is that going to earn you some sort of self-respect once you leave your corporeal body? The insides of ufology. So these are the kind of things that are out there, and I think that we're ready to change. Don't you guys think that we're ready to change?
I think so.
I mean, we're basically, human character never changes, but we're at a point now where the planet is in such upheaval. One of the things that Claire Dubois was the anthropologist who helped write the Brookings Institute report that said that it would cause humanity negative reactions for having open contact with extraterrestrials. And for years and years and years, the government's relied on the Brookings Institute report as an analysis of human behavior. But she said it would be negative. And she also made the point of saying the biggest part of human society to be negatively impacted by are the science and engineering fields.
Right.
Because they would be like, well, why are we going to reinvent everything again when we can just ask the aliens to give us the answers?
Right.
So it would put our technology and science fields into kind of a stagnant state. Okay, so that would be very damaging for our economy, global economy. Now, you'd think, well, an anthropologist should know this, but when you look at Claire Dubois' background, she was head of intelligence for all of the Pacific Fleet during World War II. She was an intelligence operative. She was a highly regarded intelligence operative. She wasn't just an anthropologist who was giving us a personal opinion. This was a woman that worked under command in secrets globally. She was very, very important. But see, that was left out of the story. We just were introduced to her as the anthropologist. Mm-hmm. So everybody goes, well, this must be true. This is what an anthropologist says. No, it's what the government's anthropologist says.
What was her name again, John?
Claire Dubois.
Claire?
Claire Dubois, right. And you can look her up. She was well known. She had a vast intelligence field behind her, highly awarded. A lot of people don't know this. A lot of the intelligence areas, even in ufology, are run by women. And they have been since World War II, because they've known since the World War II that women can get secrets out of men, but much faster and easier than men get secrets out of women or anybody else, because women have that lure over men that men just can't control. So out there's more women spies than there are men spies. There's more women working in ufology for the government than there are men. And they work. They try to trap you. When I first got involved with ufology, I remember I was at the Marina Hotel in Vegas when it was still standing. And it was Bob Brown's group who did his West Coast, ufology thing that they do, which ended up down south in Laughlin. And coming out of that, there was a girl that was there. She was a young girl. The ufologist around there kind of gravitated towards her and said she needed some help. She was in a difficult situation at home and everything. And then afterwards, I got a call from two people. I won't say their names. One of them, they were very well-known ufologists. And they said, John, can you do us a favor? And they said, what? And they go, well, some woman that was at the conference, she took this young gal and she said she could stay with her, and she's in Arizona. So she's staying with her. And I said, well, what's the problem? They said, well, she took her wallet away from her. So she doesn't have any wallet or anything, and she needs to get away from there. And she said, this woman's a kind of a freak. She thinks her son's from the dog star Sirius, and that she's going to be mating with her son so they can have the offspring of the dog star. And it sounded really whack. And they said, can you do us a favor? Can you go down there and pick her up? Because we can't. We have other commitments, but she's not too far from where you are. If you can go get her, that would be appreciated. And I had to say to them, gentlemen, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. And they were like, well, why not? There's a person to help. I said, because this is a girl who looks obviously young. You've told me she has no driver's license, and you're asking me to go bring her across state lines? I said, that's a felony. I'm not going to commit a felony for you. Okay.
Wow.
And those two said, okay. They never contacted me again. But that's how ufologists, even people coming in who are new, will get trapped by government people, even if it's other ufologists that are working for the government, to try and trap you into something they can hold criminally over you. So now they have a way to manipulate you. And that's part of the way you stay alive. You got to look for the fact that even though you may not look like anybody, there's somebody out to corrupt you because they're afraid that you might turn into somebody even in the UFO field.
John,
yes,
when
really dark.
Where's that line where you know that you're on this fine line that if you pursue too much that it could endanger your life? Where have you had that situation? I mean, not to put you on the spot, but
I know that I have on 2 occasions survived attempted hits. Okay, one was after I contacted people in the Central Intelligence Agency asking about a piece of video footage that I had seen, in which a pilot was actually talking on film about seeing a flying saucer. And just making those phone calls got somebody's attention. And driving across coming down from the Air Force Base north of Los Angeles up in there, down the 5, it's a long road. And at nighttime I was driving and I saw a car pass by me and I thought, well, it's been a long time since that car passed by me, but I can still see its taillights. Why hasn't he gone over the mountain? I kept looking in my rearview mirror. Then all of a sudden, headlights turn on, and there's a vehicle behind me, maybe about 20 feet behind me, and it's an SUV. And he suddenly turns his lights on, and I'm like, oh my God, because I was looking down the rearview mirror, and I was looking at this little red dot, it's taillights, and I was like, oh no. And then the vehicle pulls up alongside me, and as I'm looking at him, this person had some sort of a laser mounted laser beam on their dashboard, and what they were doing is they were firing the laser beam down my rear view mirror to try and blind me while I was driving.
Wow.
Right. And he stopped. He slowed down and looked at me like this, just to see, what my reaction was in the car. And after he pulled off, he just pulled off and drove. Of course, I pulled over and I called Highway Patrol and told him, but I didn't have a real good description of the vehicle because my eyes were tearing. If I had kept looking down the side of a laser beam, how many people are going to check to see that my cornea is where it suddenly burned out? So one time. And then the other time was coming back from the Grand Canyon because I was investigating this underground city they found back in 1909. I was involved in that, and then the government really jumped on me for that and threatened me through somebody else, and I didn't take them seriously. And my friend Tony and I were driving a vehicle, and we were driving through an intersection. Somebody enters the intersection and stops right in front of us as we're coming through it. And they were turning left in front of us. And then I skidded the car, and we hit broadside to each other's vehicles that blew out the windows. Wow. And then before the cop comes there, and he's talking to this guy, and I hear this guy saying, well, my son, I wasn't thinking about what I was doing, and I wasn't thinking about it, and I had the accident. It's all my fault. My son, he joined the Crips, and I've got a real problem because my son's now in a gang and everything. And then I hear him saying this. Now the cop goes to radio in for whatever, traffic or something like that. And then the man walks over to our vehicle, bends over and looks down through the driver's window, and he looks at my friend Tony and I, and he goes, I think you should know that I work for the government. And then he just stood right back up and walked away. And he wanted out of there as fast as possible, claimed he caused the wreck and everything. He just wanted out of there, and he was gone. So, these kind of things happen. And a lot of people at that point would turn around and say no more, especially after, and Tony was with me when we met the Men in Black outside the Grand Canyon Caverns. And that was the last time Tony would go with me anywhere. because when we met the Men in Black, it was too much. It was too much for my friend. He'd been with me on all these road trips, but I said, let's get out of the car and talk to him. And he said, screw you. You did this. You brought me out here. You go talk to him. He wouldn't even get out of the car and engage with them. Okay. He was so scared. And then they were so nice. They were just warning me how somebody can get hurt out there in the desert, and to be careful, so and how they were doing it so politely, you could fall down out there a bit, get bitten by a snake, or anything could happen to you where, you would be dead and nobody would even know it. And I said, well, thank you very much for your concern. And I spun on my heels and I walked away. And it took me a lot of courage to spin on my heels and walk away from a Men in Black. I mean, the real guys.
What did you find in the Grand Canyon? I assume you were looking for Kincaid's cave.
Well, in that case, yes. I'd gone into the Grand Canyon with my friend Tony. We had an idea of where it was. We went down there. We arrived at about 2:00 in the morning on the North Rim. And then about 2 days later, we were in one of the canyons, and my friend Tony had insulin with him that broke. And so he had no insulin. He was diabetic. So we had to go into a cave, and overnight he went into a coma. He was urinating fire. He said it was like urinating fire all night and crying. And next day he was in a coma, and I had to climb out of the Grand Canyon by myself with no rope because we had ropes to get us out, and I had to hand it out. And I'm not a really seasoned rock climber, so this is the stuff where you're just praying like there's somebody pushing your back against the vertical rock that you're climbing. And I got out of there. I went to on the map there was a lodge that was supposed to be attended to by one of their park rangers, and so I went to his lodge, and it was like an 11-mile walk, and I finally get to his lodge, and meanwhile Tony's is still in the cave at the bottom of the canyon, and so the ranger calls in for a flight to come out of Page, and he's sitting there talking to me, and he goes, well, you guys were out here, and he goes, you were lucky that I came out here. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, I don't usually come out here this early, but I got a phone call to come on out here. And he says, your car got here at like 2 a.m, and you went over here, and then you did a turn, and you went over here and did a turn, and then you kind of camped overnight over here. And I'm sitting there saying, yeah, that's right. And it didn't dawn me until afterwards. Well, wait a minute, this happened 2 days before you even arrived. Wow. Okay, so 2 days before he arrived, somebody was telling him what our vehicle was doing at 2 a.m. Before he was even called out there. Okay, so this is where my friend Tony and I had 9 hours of missing time. Literally 9 hours, where all of a sudden you're looking and there's a storm overhead. But it wasn't just when you're talking. What are we going to do standing out in a piece of desert for 9 hours? So we got out of there, and this is the I believe the location of where they had this underground cavern in the Grand Canyon ties into Hopi mythology, where they say that they were brought out of a hole from underground where there was an underground city, and they were brought up to the top after the last devastation by the ant people brought them to the surface, and that the ant people will take them back underground when it was time, to go back. And they said that the ant people, from my point of view, has always been the little gray aliens, because they live possibly underground. They have thin extremities, large bulbous heads, large eyes, so they could be mistaken as an ant person, maybe. And then the Hopis have their snake ancestors, or the serpent brothers, they call them, the serpent elders, and that answers to the reptilian humanoid form. So this is where the information ties in together. So when I went down there and was looking into it, I actually managed to get in touch and became good friends for over a decade with Chief Stanley Benetawak, who was the chief of the whole Hopi tribe. Now, they each have their own chief on each mesa, but he's the most traditional mesa, an older rabbi, so technically he's the chief of the Hopi. And he was telling me at some point when I was talking to him, I told this to George Norrie once, we were sitting there in the dark, he's blind, house, no running water. It's a 1-bedroom place, it's a shack, and it's his heaven. And behind him, he's sitting there in the dark, he's blind. The lights are off. There's a starlit sky. There's a window behind him that's like one of those multi-pane windows, like 3 across, 6 high or whatever. And then behind it in the dark, I saw a point of light drop down, and then it seemed to split into 2 points of light. And I could see some sort of object or something rotating and the light spinning around it behind him. And I was talking to him at the time, and I asked him about that. And he says, oh, they're just curious. They're seen all the time, but they're not a threat to these guys, even the Hopis. They're not a threat because they see them as the elder brothers, the people, the serpent beings that took them from before in ancient times and helped them. And so that city in the Grand Canyon was basically, I think, in ancient times, the whole world was connected. And we had a pre-existing global civilization that scientists are trying to tell us doesn't exist. But Graham Hancock's right on it. It was a global civilization in which we had explorers that went back to Egypt. Even Egypt had explorers that came over here into the central part of the United States, specifically the Grand Canyon. They saw it as like the Avenue of the Dead or something like where the pyramids were built, big canyon areas. They built themselves just like they built Petra. They built something into the side of the walls of the Grand Canyon. And it happened to connect to maybe a tunnel network that was pre-existing. And that tunnel network may have intersected with a reptilian humanoid culture in the Grand Canyon area. And when I was down at the Grand Canyon Caverns is where I encountered the Men in Black. For some reason, they did not want me and Tony there. The Grand Canyon Caverns in itself is world famous, but it's only a part of a much more vast cavern system that goes all the way northeast into the actual Grand Canyons. There's a lot of canyons like this. And I think that the U.S. military set up potentially maybe even missile silos clandestinely in Arizona, in the areas of even maybe the Grand Canyon, in which they have been using secretly, and that there may be other clandestine operations running around that area. I couldn't understand why out here in the middle of nowhere, why these Men in Black would appear and threaten us.
They can appear anywhere, right?
Well, they can, this is a little pull-out area off of Desert Road. These guys, their car, I didn't see any dust on it. I didn't even see dust on their shoes. Okay, they were.
I wish we could talk more about the Men in Black, but I think that we got to get ready to wrap this up. Unfortunately.
Oh my gosh, you're right.
the 2 hours go by very quick every time, but we want to thank you so much, John, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Check out John's website at reptoids.com. Hopefully, we can get you back on another time to talk more about some of these more experiences you've had.
Yeah, I'd love to do it. Thank you very much, John, for having me on, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, John. Thank you for everything. And
thank you very much.
Keep up the great work.
Thank you.